Today, we are deviating ever so slightly from our usual fare of Mesopotamian history to talk about an historical figure who is a little more recent, Jesus of Nazareth. Joining me today to answer my questions is Dr. James Tabor, retired professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. As well as an impressive selection of academic publications, Dr. Tabor has an active blog and YouTube channel. So if you are looking for more New Testament content, then please be sure to check the show notes for links to both of those. Dr. Tabor, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Megan. I always love interviewing with you. It's a pleasure.
So. The feeling is entirely mutual. Some people I do struggle a little bit with interviewing, but I feel like with you, it's usually pretty easy.
I hope so.
Now,
So I came up with this idea. Did the Gospels create Jesus, or did Jesus create the Gospels? And I called it the making of a Messiah. And what I want to bring to bear on this is something that's way beyond Jesus, just as you work way before Jesus, and that is other messianic figures throughout history. I'm not going to do too much on that. I'm going to stay with Jesus, but some in the more modern times, as well as around the time of Jesus. Josephus, the historian of the period, he lists 12 other figures that claim to be the one, or remember that question in the New Testament, are you the one or should we look for another? You know, and they had this set of expectations. So I want to delve into the notion that when you pick up Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and you read that Jesus did something, more what he did than what he said, but it could be what he said connected to it. Was that something after he lived and died and people believed he was raised from the dead, that they began to put together this bio and sort of create it, so that you might say in some cases, well, you know, most scholars would say Jesus probably never did that, or that never really happened. And that's one of the things that we often disagree on. We accept or don't accept various levels of storytelling in the Gospels, and then we sometimes take them differently because they're different. For example, this is always my favorite example with students. If you read Mark chapter 2, it's a controversy with Pharisees about picking grain on the Sabbath. You know, is that considered work? And some of Jesus' critics objected to the fact that they were doing that. But if you turn over to Matthew 12, you get Matthew's rewriting of Mark. And it's not a matter, as you know well, Megan, of conflating them together. Oh, let's be sure they all harmonize. We actually sort of delight in the differences, not because we're devilish or anything, because we want to see what is underlying that story. And if you, I'm not going to go over those now, but if you look them up, you'll see that they give different reasons and even different answers that Jesus gave. So here's the question. Did Matthew have Mark, which we think he did, as his source, and just sort of, oh, I think I'll add this, or did he have that and Mark didn't have it? And how would you tell? No, I'm not going to be able to solve this. This is the ultimate chicken and egg question, right? Did somebody say Jesus did it, or did Jesus do it? And then they said he did it. But I think I've come up with a method that we might be able to clarify one or two things. And the main thing I'm going to argue is that Jesus well might have had what I would call a messianic self-consciousness or a messianic self-identity. I can't prove that, but I actually picked two texts because I knew we were going to talk about this. Imagine if you're a pious Jew of the first century, as Jesus we think was, and you're reading along in Psalm 40, and you come to this verse. I'll read it. Sacrifice and offering you do not desire. My ears you've opened. This person seems to feel God is talking to them. Burnt offering and sin offering you do not require. Then I said, who's the I? Presumably the writer. It actually says a Psalm of David. You know, whether that's true or not, it doesn't matter. Maybe David experienced this. But somebody reading it later, like a Jesus figure, now it gets better. Look, I said, Lo, I come, in the volume of the book it is written of me. What is this? In the volume of the book, is that like the Torah, maybe? That's, I mean, that might be the book referred to here. I delight to do your will. Your law is written in my heart. So you see how personalized that is. But it gets better. If you go to Isaiah, and Isaiah has these 4 suffering servant hymns, they're called. You've dealt with this with Bard and so forth. And it's second Isaiah from chapter 40 on. So you have 12 references to the servant, and it's almost always Israel. But 4 different times it seems to take an individual turn where it might be the writer or somebody the writer's talking about, but it seems to get rather personal. Now notice this one. This is Isaiah 50, verse 4. It sounds very similar to that psalm I just read. The Lord God has given me the tongue of the learned. Who, you'd think that's the writer, but we don't know the writer. Maybe somebody's reading it later, like a Jesus figure. That I should know how to speak a word in season to him who is weary. Remember, Jesus said, "Come unto me, you that are weary." Is he beginning to get ideas like this? I'm supposed to do that. I'm supposed to be the guy that does this. He wakens me morning by morning. He wakens my ear to hear like the learned. He's opened my ear. I was not rebellious. Then it gets really kind of scary. I gave my back to the smiters and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting, but the Lord will help me. So just 2 examples. Now, that's not an event. That's actually trying to enter into the mind of someone who might begin to think, am I called for a special purpose? Everybody's waiting for messiahs to come, either a priestly messiah, a Davidic messiah, that would be a king, or maybe both. But then you have candidates. I call it categories and candidates. So you've got a category of a priestly figure or a Davidic figure. And then you've got a possible candidate, somebody that says, I think this could be talking about me. Now, if that is the way it operates, and I think I can show in a couple of cases without, outside of Jesus, that sort of drives people. Now, it could just be seen as a form of mental illness, frankly. I go to Jerusalem a lot, and there's this phenomenon that people discuss openly. It's called the Jerusalem syndrome. Have you heard of it? It is the idea that it's almost always Christians, not always, but 95% of the time it's Christians who feel that they have been called especially to go to Jerusalem and do something very messianic or meaningful. They believe in Jesus, of course. He's in heaven. He's raised from the dead. But they begin to maybe go to the Western Wall and maybe talk to Orthodox Jews about the Lord or something like that. But they feel like they're special. Sometimes that can border on a problem because they might try to do something. For example, I think it was in the 70s, there was a gentleman, I think his name was Dennis Rohan, and he said, oh, my name spelled backwards, Rohan, would go back to, I can't remember if it was Rohan, what would that be, Nahum or something? Yeah, I guess, yeah. Anyway, he figured something like that out, and he tried to burn down the Alaska Mosque. He was caught. That's the mosque on top of where the Dome of the Rock is. So Jerusalem syndrome is somebody that's kind of crazy, and often they have to be given mental care. Like I think you've kind of lost it here. But so I'm not going to accuse Jesus of anything like that. But if he is reading predictions of the Messiah, I don't want to give away my talk, of course, but I pick 5 examples in the life of Jesus that I think he actually might have done this particular activity as a kind of messianic pantomime or signal. So that even though we couldn't show externally, oh yeah, he probably did that. Like, I'll give away one. Did he really ride down the Mount of Olives on a donkey? You know, it's reported in the Gospels, I think all three actually, of the synoptics, and John, I think, yeah, John has it too. So all four say he did, but Mark is the first. They might have all got it from Mark, but often that's dismissed. That's the disciple, that's the evangelist rather, writing the Gospels later, trying to make him fit. Because there's a prophecy in the book of Zechariah, as you know, Zechariah 9:9. Behold, your king comes to you, glorious and triumphant, but humble, riding on the ass, in the foal of an ass. So you get this kind of comical scene. You know, the war horse is the mighty Messiah, but instead you got this guy kind of going like this on a donkey. Because when adults ride donkeys, their feet almost touch the ground, and it's not exactly a majestic image. So did they just think, oh, well, we'll have him do that? Now, I'm not going to be able to answer this. What I'm going to present is tentative, and I'm leaning this way, and I'm trying to draw conclusions.
What do historians mean when they refer to the historical Jesus?
Yes, well, it depends a lot on your presuppositions. And you ask, what do historians think? And that's who we're going to hear from. But let me back up and just contrast it a little bit. If someone is a very fundamentalist Christian, not to use labels, but in other words, they think, you want to know about Jesus? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You know, that's it. What's the quest? Can't you read? You know, that sort of thing. Or this old thing I used to hear. I went to Sunday school growing up here and there along the way. Somebody would read in a Bible class a verse, and anybody have a comment on that? And somebody, I think it means about what it says. Okay, let's go to the next verse. You know, it's self-evident. So these historians come in and they muddy the water, but in a way they're not muddying the water. The water's already muddied. As we've got these four sources, they're not all the same, but it's not a matter of contradictions. We want the richness of the text. In other words, I mentioned before a story in Mark 2 about Jesus doing something. His disciples are picking grain on the Sabbath. Technically, that's work. What's wrong with that? And I'm not going to go into that now, but you can look it up in your own Bible, Mark chapter 2. Jesus gives an answer. But go to Matthew 12 and you'll get a different answer. In fact, part of Mark's answer he even takes out. So it's not a matter of us doing this. Oh, let's make it one text, because we want to allow each author to speak and to convey to us what it is that they're saying. So that's the first part of what historical work is all about, is ask, what are your sources? And they're not just in the New Testament. I think we're going to talk about that, but let's stay with the New Testament for a moment. Clearly, those are our primary sources, but they're not biographies. You know, Mark Goodacre is going to talk about the missing pieces. And I interviewed him this week, and I'm not going to give it away, but it's going to be interesting. There's so much that we don't know. There are missing pieces to this puzzle. And you know what? They didn't give us the cover to the puzzle on the box where we can say, oh, well, that's missing, but we can see what it's like that got lost. You're at a thrift store and all you got is the box with the pieces. And now you're trying to figure it out. So it's an analogy, but you see the idea. So what do? We actually take texts, history, archaeology, every lens that we can bring to bear, so that if we read about Pharisees, we would want to know, well, what else do we know about Pharisees? You know, we have a historian, Josephus, who claims to have been a Pharisee, or who claims to be a Pharisee at the time he's writing. He goes through several Jewish schools. Paul in the New Testament mentions his background as a Pharisee and several things about it in his letters. But we would take Philo. We have other writers contemporary. We have the Mishnots a little bit later. But the idea is that you would have all of your data, and within the New Testament itself, you would do careful reading and comparison, and you would try to ascertain what might be the earliest layers of the material. And that's where it gets exciting, because it's actually possible to pull out some of the earlier layers of, say, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, one of the things scholars have noticed, and it's usually called Q, but don't freak out with Q if you've heard of Q, because they're, oh, I don't believe in Q, and Mark Goodacre said it's not true. That's not the point. Everybody believes that there's material that Matthew and Luke have in common that they didn't get from Mark. Now, why does everybody agree? Because it's in there. You could just go through a parallel and there it is. And if you pull that material out, Bart's talked about this a lot, you get this body of material. We don't have to call it Q. We could call it XYZ or just call it this body of material. And then we read it. We have two versions, one in Matthew, one in Luke. We begin to hear a different voice of Jesus. It's actually quite striking. And, Bart has done plenty on this. I'm not going to rehearse all of that, but it's exciting to have these layers. And then Luke, for example, has his own material that nobody has. How should we evaluate that? And if you just took what that's called L usually because of Luke, if you took the L material, everything that he has, that he's added to Mark, that he's added to the Q source, if you want to call it that, what is that like? Does it have kind of a coherence? We also try to find themes with each writer, emphases and things that they are really strong about, because that helps us it gives us another filter, not to get rid of material, but to try to understand it in the light of that author's interest. For example, Luke's easy to do, constantly emphasizing women, forgiveness, and the grace of God. So here's a quiz. You don't even have to know the New Testament. I just told you the answer. Who has Jesus, and only in this gospel, say, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do? On the cross, forgives his enemies. If you know your gospels, you don't even have to know who says it. Like, was that Luke or Luke? Why? Because he always does that, you see. Who never reprimands or blames the disciples for not understanding? He never does that. Again, Luke. Even when they're sleeping in the garden and not staying up all night with Jesus. Remember his last night when he's struggling and he goes 3 times. Luke says they were sleeping for sorrow. So, okay, if you're sleeping for sorrow, that's not so bad. Whereas you read Mark's account. So it sounds like I'm bringing up contradictions, and there are differences for sure. But we want to recognize those differences and try to understand what might be going on in that particular version. Think of it as 4 films or 4 paintings, and there are different ways of expressing maybe the same basic underlying theme or idea that you're trying to represent. And that's how I think of the Gospels. And no matter what one's approach is, the goal for many of us is to try to say something that we could say as historians is really most likely. And surprisingly, we come up with a list of things that we're quite sure of. Like Jesus is from the Galilee. It's nice to get it, the things that everybody agrees on, frankly, that if somebody said, oh, well, I don't think he ever went to the north of the country, probably just lived in Jerusalem his whole life. Well, there's, historically speaking, that seems to be highly unlikely, if not just, can't be right. It's like putting Abraham Lincoln. He was actually in New York. He was born in New York and, he lived in Manhattan. No, that's not true of Abraham Lincoln. So we go through and we try to sort through. But I want to emphasize to everybody listening that it is a positive and creative enterprise, not a destructive and minimalizing enterprise. It might seem like that, but you're not so much getting rid of things as looking carefully at the material that we have. And I think if we could take a poll of the 13 scholars, there would be differences between us for sure. But there would also be a sort of common core that we would agree could be said about the historical Jesus, what he did, what he taught, what he was all about.
Fantastic. Thank you. When you're doing this kind of work, are there sources outside of the New Testament that you can use to help kind of add to that common core of things that people agree on?
Yes, there are. I wish there were more, because the four Gospels are the fullest kinds of records that we have, and they're probably the earliest. I would say they are. But one I would mention that many have never heard of, maybe, but you can actually get it online, the Didache, 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 sometimes people, but it means teaching. And it was discovered in the late 19th century, as you would expect, in a monastery or library, and had been overlooked. The historian Eusebius mentions it. He's a 4th century historian, so he had it. He doesn't think much of it because he's a very orthodox headed Christian. You know, he's friends with Constantine and goes along with the Council of Nicaea, but he's aware of it. And we now have a copy of it. Our own Bart Ehrman translated it in the Loeb Classical Library, the Harvard series, where you have the Greek and the English, and it's a wonderful translation. But within that, you have some material that I think we would want to keep as historical and supplement the things that we have in our Gospels. My favorite is some sayings of Jesus that aren't in the Gospels. And you say, well, then how are you possibly going to know it was Jesus? It's almost by correlation. I'll give you my favorite. Let's say you're going to give a gift, to God or church or whatever. You're just giving a gift as an act of charity. Let your gift sweat in your hands until you know to whom you're giving it. There you go. So I've got my $100 bill I'm going to give you, Megan, but I'm doing it just to impress you. Remember what Jesus said, don't give your gifts, do it in secret, so that, you're doing it for the good, not for your own credit. So I'm going to give you this, but wait, I've got to hold it a minute. Okay, it's for Megan, it's for Megan, it's for Megan, but really, okay, Megan, close your eyes, here it is, see? So did he say that? I'm going to say, yeah, he probably did. I'm just glad we have things like that. And you can read the opening of the Didache. It has the two ways that echo some of the things we know from Jesus. But the main thing, when you get to the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper of the bread and the wine, guess what? It's not the body and blood of Jesus. What? And it's Christian. It is Christian. It mentions Jesus, your son, but it doesn't interpret them sacrificially. So that would mean that maybe what Mark has about the Last Supper might not be as historical because it comes from Paul. Paul's the one who first mentions that in one of his letters, 1 Corinthians 11. You say, yeah, but why would you favor that over the other? Well, guess what? John doesn't have the Last Supper. Well, I correct myself. He has a Last Supper, but you know what it is? One verse. And after supper, he took a basin of water and towels and washed his disciples' feet and started talking about, I'm going to get betrayed tonight. But no account of the bread, the wine. And so here you have three versions of the Last Supper. One where it's just after the supper, so it's not even related. That's John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Paul, the traditional, and then the Didache. And so there are other sources. There's another one that was discovered in 1945 in Egypt, in a jar, buried in a field, supposedly a fertilizer field, at a place in Upper Egypt called Nag Hammadi, in a number of texts, but the one that most of us are most interested in, at least many of us are, is the Gospel of Thomas. And it claims to be a different record of the sayings of Jesus. Some we know from our Gospels, some are slightly different. And one of them, I think it's saying 14, the disciples say, well, when you leave us, we're going to be orphans. Who is going to guide us? Remember, that's asked in the Gospel of John. What do we're going to be left alone. What he says, oh, I'll send the Holy Spirit and the Spirit will guide you. Guess what it says in Thomas? Wherever you go to James the Just, the brother of Jesus. So there you have revealed a character that our Gospels make no mention of, really. Mark mentions the brothers of Jesus, James, Joseph, Jude, and Simon, but he doesn't go, and that guy James took over and he was the successor and he's the main guy, and it's kind of a caliphate, really, where the next brother and the next brother are relative. Well, we actually know now from other church records that Gospel of Thomas saying is probably correct, that the earliest followers of Jesus began looking to James. And even Paul in his letters, he says, I went up to Jerusalem and I saw Peter, Cephas, if it's, some people think it's not Peter, I think it might be. I saw Cephas, I stayed with him, I think he says 15 days. And then I saw James, the brother of the Lord. And almost like, and when he mentions the people there, he says there's James, Peter, and John. They are the pillars of the church. That's not James the fisherman. This is the brother of Jesus. So there's a source that could begin to help you see that our Gospels are giving an aspect of the life of Jesus. And finally, Luke, for example, whoever wrote Luke also wrote the book of Acts. And in chapter 15, he's got the oddest thing. The first crisis that the group faces is what to do with Gentiles, non-Christians. Gentiles wanting to join. They're coming right out of their Greek and Roman religions of various types, and they believe now in the one God, and they believe Jesus is the Messiah, and he's going to return soon. What do we do with them? And there's a conference in Jerusalem. And after everybody speaks, like Paul speaks, Peter speaks, all the apostles are there. And then James, unidentified, stands up. It just says, and James stood up and said, my decision is. You go, who are you? And what do you mean your decision is? Who gave you the right to make? Well, now we have the Gospel of Thomas. We have other texts. Paul, he's listed first as the pillar of the church. You see how we can put together and supplement so that I think we're getting back to more of the historical situation. And Paul says, it's not in the Gospels, that Jesus appeared to Peter, to the 12, to all the apostles, and to James, his brother. Well, we don't have any account of that, but we have Paul, who got it firsthand, maybe from James, who said, yeah, he appeared to me. So it's so enriching to get all of this material. And boy, you're going to get it at this conference, believe me.
Something I really love about the historical method is looking at how all of these different sources interweave to provide a much fuller, richer understanding of what was going on in any specific time period.
Absolutely. So
now, given the prominent place that Christianity has held during the development of Western civilization, do you think that separating historical facts about Jesus from historical thought, do you think that can be a contentious endeavor?
It can be. Sometimes people talk about the Jesus of history, Jesus, and the Christ of faith. And actually, I think all Christians on one level talk like that. They might say, well, they're the same, but at least they would admit that the Jesus of history is the human Jesus on earth, and the Christ of faith usually is seen as the glorified heavenly Jesus. Historians stay away from that in the sense that it's not something you can examine. In other words, what you can always say, like, for example, Dale Allison, I'm so glad he's on the program. He's got a lecture, Did Jesus Really Do Miracles? And I've talked to him about it. I interviewed him just like you're interviewing me, and I'm not going to give that away either. And he didn't give it away. But you see the question. Say, well, you historians, you don't think anything supernatural ever happened. So anything reported about Jesus or anybody else in history, that's all just myth and made up and so forth. Well, actually, that's not the position any of us take. The position you could say something did Jesus really walk on water? reports in Mark that he walked on water. It's not a historical question. Why? How would I investigate it? I can say, as a historian, in his final week, Jesus went to Jerusalem, confronted the authorities, and was crucified by the Romans and reported to be alive on the third day. I think that's a historical statement. I don't know any major historian that would disagree with that. There are always people that come up with other things, or people that think he didn't even exist. That's another question. But how, sometimes my students ask, well, Dr. Tabor, do you believe the miracles? And I would just have to say, look, in the class, we're doing historical Jesus. I have no way of investigating that, but I can talk about how other figures of the time, like Apollonius of Tyana, you've done shows on that with Bart, things like that were reported of him. That wouldn't mean he didn't do them and Jesus did, or Jesus did and he didn't. It doesn't mean anything other than people began to circulate stories about Jesus as an exorcist, as a healer. Some of the things seem to echo Elijah and Elisha in the Hebrew Bible. And that should give us a bit of pause, because it might be a common thing that you say about a messianic kind of figure, that, well, they need to be able to do something to demonstrate it. But actually in the Gospels, whenever Jesus is asked, give us a sign, come on, if you're really it, do something. Remember in Jesus Christ Superstar, Herod said, walk across my swimming pool, if you're really the guy. And in Luke, it says Jesus just looked at him and did not answer a word, probably because he killed his cousin John brutally. And he just looks at him like this. He won't talk to Herod, this is in Luke. So I think there's a difference in what you're trying to do. And people have faith for all sorts of reasons. They could have a personal conversion experience. They could just read the text in a more fundamentalist way. Whatever it says, that's what I believe. But even if you say that, there's still interpretation. I could ask you, well, how did James end up in charge in Acts 15 that I mentioned earlier? You can't just, well, James is in charge. I mean, we can't talk about it. Why is it suddenly mentioned when it's never mentioned before, even hinted at, and so forth? So is that kind of the point of your question, the idea of theology, what the church has come to affirm, more the creedal statements? Have you noticed, Megan, in the creedal statements, let's just do the Apostles' Creed because it's the earliest and the most simple. You believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth. That's how you start. And then you talk about Jesus Christ, and you say that he was crucified, born of a virgin, crucified, dead, and buried, and raised the third day. Okay, you just skipped his life. Born of a virgin, okay, that's Matthew 1, Luke 2. Wait, you jumped to the end. Dead and buried.
There's a lot of stuff in that.
All of a sudden, you're just
in that gap there, yeah.
And you say, well, that's the main thing. He died for your sins. Would you accept him right now? That's not what historians do. And we wouldn't do it with any figure. It's not that we're treating Jesus differently, like, oh, but he's the Lord and he created the whole world and he's God in the flesh. Well, those are beliefs people have. Those are beliefs that the church developed. But even among early believers, there was a lot of dissension and discussion. This didn't get resolved in a day. It didn't get resolved in a year. It didn't get resolved in 100 years, 200 years. For 300 years, people were, well, I think he's human, but maybe he got inspired, but he's not God. Oh, but he's fully God, and on and on and on. So it's not as though these are closed questions. They weren't closed for 300 years. And these are the people that were the closest to the time, and they're not sure of these things. So as historians, we try to sort through this for people. We want to clarify. We want to say, what are the options? What are the sources? Let's put the texts out. Archaeology, I mentioned earlier. I do a lot of archaeology. I've spent 33 years doing various sites, and that helps tremendously because if you're going to read about these places in these times, And you can actually go to some of these places, like the urban center of the Galilee was a town called Sepphoris, never mentioned in the Gospels. Guess what? Nazareth is 4 miles south of Sepphoris. So Sepphoris, Nazareth is actually a suburb of the major urban capital of the Galilee, not mentioned in the New Testament. But excavations at Sepphoris have revealed all sorts of things about the urban background of Jesus, because he's right there. The gleaming city on a hill is probably Sepphoris. So archaeology helps. All these other texts you mentioned and asked me about help. And, you know, it's an embarrassment of riches in a way, because there is a lot. I mean, look at all the books in our different libraries, and and this is just what I have at home here to work on directly, but so much could be written and studied. But on the other hand, there's so much we don't know. So we need humility. And I think everybody on the program, if you ask them at the end, well, how sure are you of what you're saying? I think they would say that I've come to this view, but I'm open to other views, and I've changed my mind at various points in time throughout my career. So you're getting the best. You're getting the best of the best.
I think so. Dr. Tabor, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Megan.